So the first step in creating our Aquabot is to prepare what will become the controller of our Aquabot for the wiring. So before we can actually wire everything up and connect the tether to the motor, we have to prepare the actual box itself to be wired. So to do this, we're going to start with the base. I'm going to use a 1/2 inch conduit PVC piece, our steel conduit lock nut, and our 2 large washers, which will be used as spacers between the conduit and the bottom of the box. So take a look at your conduit lock nut and note that the 6 sort of teeth on the outside portion of it all face a certain direction. So you're going to want to place your conduit on the table itself so that the conduit lock nut teeth face out and away from the table. This is how we're going to screw it onto our conduit lock nut once we have it inside this Tupperware container. So take your 2 spacer washers, place them directly on your conduit, and then place the bottom of our Tupperware container directly onto the conduit, and you'll note that maybe 1 or 2 threads left on the conduit are left exposed. This is so that the maximum amount of space needed for the wiring can be utilized. If we just, left these 2 spacers off and put the conduit directly in here, the wires when they come into, the wires when they come into this Tupperware container and the controller would have a more tough time being wired up. So we don't do that. Instead, we have spacers. And because of the amount of space left to actually screw the lock nut on, we have to take note of where the teeth are. So the teeth are going to be facing away from the surface here. And then we're going to screw this on with our fingers. I'm going to screw this on right here. And then we'll tighten it in a minute. But just screw it on with your hand and then test to be sure that the conduit is firmly in place. Then use either pliers or a wrench to tighten it, and then test the actual conduit to make sure that it is firmly in place. So once you firmly put the lock nut in place, test the conduit to make sure it's not coming out, and now you've prepared the base of your box. So once we've made sure that the conduit is firmly in place, we've now prepared the base of our controller for the wiring. The next step will be split up into 3 parts, and we will be preparing the lid of our container, or the Tupperware controller, for the wiring as well. So we will split it up into the rheostat, which goes here, the on and off switch, which will go here, and then the 3 individual switches which control the individual motors. Now for this, we're going to need our rheostat, which looks like this. It comes in a small cardboard box like this. And then inside that box should also be these 2 small screws, which should have nuts that come on them. 1, 2. So the first thing we're going to do, once we've made sure that we have our rheostat, is notice that there are 2 nuts that are directly on the rheostat. One is removable. We are going to remove the top nut, which is removable. The bottom one is not removable unless you actually break this brass piece right here. So we're going to remove this, and then we're going to test to be sure that this actually fits inside of our Tupperware container. Now, it should be noted that a rheostat is going to control the speed at which the motor here works. So inside of this rheostat is finely wound copper wire, which will control the amount of power that is granted to the switch here. So it has an on position, a maximum power position, which is marked by this here, and then a minimum power position, which is marked here. So for right now, it doesn't matter where this rotating piece is centered, but for right now, I'm just going to keep it at its max power setting. And then it should also be noted that at the very top, there is this tiny metal little lip or segment that kind of comes up facing out and away from the rheostat. This is going to go in this tiny hole here. So test to be sure that your rheostat fits by placing the rheostat center through the min and max hole and then being sure that your little metal lip right here comes up and is stationary through this hole. You can be sure that this works by trying to rotate your rheostat back and forth. If it doesn't rotate back and forth, then you know that your metal piece is firmly and securely in there. This hole is drilled here for this metal piece so that when the knob is placed onto your rheostat and is used to turn this piece down here, this way you'll be sure that the rheostat itself won't rotate because this is locked into the hole, and that you'll be sure that this piece down here rotates. If this is flattened and you try and rotate the knob, the likelihood is that the entire rheostat itself will rotate. And so it will give the impression that your rheostat is actually broken and this piece itself is in reality not actually moving. You're actually just rotating the entire rheostat. So the first thing we're going to do before we actually install it here, now that we've made sure that the rheostat fits into that small hole there, is going to place these two screws through two of these holes. So take off the nuts from the rheostat screws. Take them off individually. And one is going to go through the center hole here. Just screw it in with your hand. It doesn't really matter at this point how far down it goes. I'm going to do just about halfway. And then take the other screw. And then looking at it so that you have the rheostat upside down. So this is right side up with the knob portion standing up. This is upside down. You're going to place it on the right peg hole. So screw it in there with your fingers. Just make sure that it's at not going in at an angle, in which case you'll be able to tell because it'll be very difficult to screw in. Just screw it down about halfway, and then take the individual nuts and just screw them up until they reach that metal lip. Once your rheostat looks like this, you're going to flip it right back side up and place it through there. And you're going to take your nut for the top of the rheostat and screw it all the way down using a pair of pliers or a wrench to secure it in place. And now your container should look like this. Now that we've installed the base of our controller with our conduit lock nut as well as the spacers, and we've made sure that our rheostat is firmly in place in the lid, we're going to install the on and off switch into the bottom right hand corner of our lid here. So all we need for this is the on and off switch as well as the two nuts and the washer that come directly on it. Now the on and off switch is the large red switch and is much different from the three smaller switches that control your individual motors. Now the on and off switch has a faceplate with the off pointing to the left and the on pointing to the right. When we install this, we have to make sure that this corresponds to the actual labeling on the lid. Now the first thing we're going to do is take off the first top nut on our switch, remove that, and remove the washer as well. Now the likelihood is that the second nut on your switch will not be all the way down. We want to make sure that this is screwed all the way down against the top of our switch, and you can even use a pair of pliers or a wrench to tighten it if it is large enough, but for right now this should be fine. Just tighten it a little bit more. This way we have the maximum number of exposed threads above the surface of our lid. So now making sure that the on corresponds to the actual label on our Aquabotz lid, we're going to slide the switch through, making sure that this is all the way against the top of our, the bottom and underside of our lid. Then we're going to take our washer, put it over the top, and then we're going to take our second nut and screw it all the way down, and then we're going to tighten it with a pair of pliers or a wrench. Holding your switch firmly in place as you finish tightening the nut onto the switch. Be sure that the switch is generally unable to turn, and that way you know that your switch is firmly in place and will not be moving unless a significant amount of force is actually applied to it in order to actually move it. So this way, when we are wiring the switch, we're sure that the switch itself will not actually move when the wires are being tightened or pulled. Once you've completed putting in your on and off switch, as well as your rheostat, it's time to put in the last 3 switches for your controller. Now these three switches look exactly the same from each other, except one of them is completely separate. If you test them, you'll find that 2 of them require human force to keep them at an angle, or in an on position. These 2 are this in that case. The third one requires no human force or human touch to actually keep it in an on position. Angled straight up, it is off, and at an angle, these switches are on and toggle power to the individual motors. The one that is separate from the other 2, the one that requires no force to keep it at an angle, will be our central motor here. It is this switch that the rheostat controls the power to. Now to install our switches, we're going to install the first, what's called the non-moment DPDT switch, the one that requires no force to keep it at an on position. We're going to put this one in first. So you'll notice that all the way down at the bottom of these switches, or against the red portion, or with the metal top, are 3 individual pieces of metal. The first is a nut that keeps them in place. The next is a star washer, and the third is a toothed washer. Now before we put this in, take a look at the grooves and the threads along the switch. You notice that there is a cutout in the actual threads themselves, and this is where our toothed washer will go. The toothed washer on the interior side of the washer has a little tooth that is able to slide down this groove in the threads. This, on this individual switch, as well as the other 2 switches, will be facing down towards the bottom of our controller, with the Aquabotz and the on and off switch towards the bottom. So you're going to slide your switch through the top, installing the non-moment DPDT switch first, and then you're going to take your toothed washer, making sure that the tooth itself is actually facing down towards the bottom of the controller. You're going to slide that on, followed by your star washer, and then third, you're going to put on the nut, and then tighten it with either a pair of pliers or an adjustable wrench. This is the only switch that matters in which exact position it gets placed. The other 2 switches can go into either one of the ports on the left, or either one of the holes on the left or the right side of the rheostat. They do not have a specific place that they need to be. So we're going to install the next switch here, remembering to take off our nut, our star washer, and our toothed washer. And like the other switch that we just put in, we're going to make sure that the groove in the actual threads is facing down towards the bottom of the box for uniformity's sake. And then we're going to put the toothed washer on first, noting that the tooth itself is pointed down and not up. Put on the star washer, and then put on the nut. And then we will do this for the third and final switch. So once we have all 3 switches firmly in place, I'm going to look on the underside and make sure that all pieces of our lid are firmly in place, the rheostat's not moving, and now your container should look like this.